Nature versus nurture, one of pop psychology's most famous false dichotomies. And it probably comes as no surprise that nature and nurture don't work in isolation. Our genes and other biological systems interact with our life experiences and mental processes. And it's this complex web that puts some people at risk of mental illness. In the next two videos, we're going to focus on the biological pieces of that complex puzzle, genetics and neuroscience. So I trust that you all remember that high school biology class where you learnt about phenotype, the observed characteristics of an organism, and genotype, the specific set of genes contained in the organism's DNA that code for that particular characteristic. And just to refresh your memory, remember that a specific variant of a gene is called an allele. Alleles are a bit like flavours. If we pretend that there's a gene for ice cream, then choc chip might be one allele and strawberry might be a different allele. We all inherit 2 copies of each allele for each gene, 1 copy from each parent. So we each end up with 2 alleles that determine eye colour, 2 alleles that determine hair colour, and so on. Given that DNA is the blueprint for life, of course a person's genotype influences the phenotypic traits that we observe, but the environment almost always plays a role too. This is why identical twins who have identical genotypes will still have some minor phenotypic differences in their fingerprints, their facial features, and their personalities. Although they're genetically identical, twins have always experienced slightly different environments, even if those differences are simply which side of the womb they spent most of their time on. Now, if all those terms like genotype and phenotype meant absolutely nothing to you, then click here to learn about genes and alleles, or here to learn about phenotype and genotype. Unlike traits such as hair colour, psychological factors like our personality and our inherited risk of mental illness are usually polygenic. And that simply means that the trait is influenced by multiple genes. So there's not just one single gene that determines a person's IQ, or one single gene that determines someone's friendliness, fearfulness, or resilience. Psychological factors are influenced by lots of different genes as well as our life experiences. The overwhelming majority of mental illnesses also have a polygenic risk factor. One notable exception is early onset Alzheimer's disease. There are 3 known deterministic genes for this disease: PS1, PS2, and APP. If you inherit just one of these genes, no matter how much Sudoku or exercise you do, no matter how much kale you eat, you will develop Alzheimer's before the age of 60. A 4th gene, ApoE, behaves a bit more like genes for other mental illnesses. Essentially, if you inherit the ApoE gene, it will increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will develop the disorder. So how does inheriting certain genes increase a person's risk of developing mental illness? Some genes increase the risk of mental illness by influencing the way a person responds to different life situations. One of the models that explains how this works is the diathesis stress model. This model explains that a person will inherit a certain risk factor, like the ApoE gene, and that risk factor leaves the person vulnerable for developing mental illness, but only if they're ever faced with particular life stresses. And just like ApoE and Alzheimer's, it's entirely possible for a person to carry this genetic risk and live their whole life without ever developing the disorder. You see, it's a bit like being unable to swim. That risk factor would never be a problem unless you suddenly found yourself plonked in deep water. And so you can see that mental illness is not always a simple case of nature or nurture. It's the interaction between the inherited risk factors and the environment that the person experiences that produces that disorder. Now, it's probably not surprising that our genes can affect the way we respond to environmental stresses, but what if I told you that inheriting certain genes can actually increase your risk of experiencing those negative life events? Strange, hey? But the gene-environment correlation model explains how inheriting certain genes can actually attract trouble to your life, a bit like a magnet for bad luck. A recent study into bullying found that a child's genetics were the prime factor in determining whether the child was bullied, whether they were a perpetrator of bullying, or, the most common scenario, where they were a bully in some circumstances and a victim at other times. What's probably most confronting about this study's findings is that being a victim of bullying is a highly heritable trait. But how can this be? Surely there's not a bullying victim gene? No, there's not. But other traits like low self-esteem can be strongly influenced by a child's genetics. And so what we see with bullying is that children with a genetic predisposition to behave in a self-deflating way can actually elicit hostile treatment from their peers. Now, if you think that it's strange that someone's genes can predispose them to being bullied, then epigenetics will certainly blow your mind. Wow! The epigenome is the stuff outside our DNA that controls which genes are turned on or turned off. Just like a light switch, if a gene is turned on, then the phenotypic trait it codes for will be expressed. If the gene is switched off, then the trait won't be expressed. Now, what's really surprising is that the environment a person experiences, the stresses they encounter, the food that they eat, all this stuff changes which genes are turned on or off. And those epigenetic factors can be passed down from parent to child to grandchild for many, many generations. So if you live a super stressful life and are fueled by nothing but cheeseburgers and ice cream, well, the changes that environment is making in your epigenome can be passed down to your kids and to their kids. Not so long ago, the idea that non-genetic material could be passed down generations was pretty controversial. So how did researchers discover this? Well, researchers and lab technicians had noticed that lab rats have two primary parenting styles. The rat mums that lick their newborn pups a lot, the super mum high lickers, and the rats that don't lick their pups very much at all, the neglectful low lickers. The lab techs noticed that the pups of high lickers grew up to be really calm and they were easy to handle, whereas the pups of low lickers grew up to be very anxious and they reacted fearfully and aggressively when handled. And on the surface, this all looks pretty self-explanatory, hey? The anxious mums are just passing on their genes for anxiety. Right? Wrong. The researchers tested this idea in a cross-fostering experiment. Half the high lickers pups were given to high-licking foster mums, and the other half were given to low-licking foster mums. Same with the pups of low lickers. Half went to low-licking foster mums, and half went to high-licking foster mums. Now, if the anxiety was genetically determined, then all of the offspring of low-licking mums should develop anxiety regardless of who raised them. But that's not what the researchers saw at all. It was the parenting style of the foster parent, not the biological parent, that determined how anxious the pup was in later life. And this effect got passed down when the pups had pups and when those pups had pups. But why? What's going on here? Find out in our next video. Fight, flight, and the HPA axis.